want to invite you this morning to open up in your New Testament to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11 is where we will take our study from this morning. You know, if you're like most people, your mailbox is often filled with various kinds of offers, invitations of one kind or another every week. Some might be a grand opening or a sales event or a credit card offer times about 1,000. Whatever. Lots of different things come our way. And we take those and we throw most of those invitations in the trash, just get rid of them. But on other occasions, we might find an invitation that we would never throw away. You might get the invitation for the wedding of a friend or a loved one or a graduation or something along those lines. And we don't treat those the way we do those other offers. If you get an invitation to show up at the courthouse for jury duty, just go ahead and tell you it's not in your best interest to discard that, And what I'm trying to say this morning is that not all invitations are of equal importance. Some can be disregarded, some demand that we respond, and others it may be a joy for us to respond. Well, in our study this morning, I want us to take a look at the greatest invitation that has ever been extended. And it's certainly one that should not be disregarded. It demands a response, but it's also one that our response ought to be with great joy. It ought to produce that in us. And so Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, he says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light," he says. And so as we begin this morning, before we really talk about the invitation itself, I want us to take just a moment to talk about the one who gave it. And the reason I want to do that is because this invitation really only has significance because of the one who extended it in the first place. And so I want to point out three things about Jesus before we look at the invitation that he gave. And the first thing that I want to point out this morning about Jesus is that he is the only one who truly knows God, and therefore he is the only one who can reveal God to us. And that ought to impress us. One of the lessons I think people sometimes need to hear is that we can't know God by natural means. I think a lot of people have tried that. I think a lot of people try that today. They just kind of sort of in their mind rationalize and reason out what God is like. That doesn't really work. A lot of people feel like they've done that. But I want to suggest to you that they haven't. And not all on their own. Because the only way we could ever come to know God is by him revealing himself to us, by him choosing to make himself known. And so just before issuing what we call this great invitation here in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus would say there in verse 27, he would say that no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. That's how God's made known. That's how he's revealed to us. And so Jesus says he's the only one who truly knows God, and therefore the only way we can come to know God is through him, what he reveals to us about God. And in part, that's what Jesus came into the world to do. He came in order to reveal God to mankind, to show us what God is like. That's what John would say in John chapter 1 and verse 18. He would say, "No one has ever seen God." God is invisible. He's referred to as the invisible God at times. And no one has seen God, John said. The only God who's at the Father's side, he has made him known. Or as a different translation says there in John 1 verse 18, he has shown us what God is like. That's what Jesus did when he came into the world. And so this invitation that Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 11, at least in part, is an invitation to get to know God. He said that the only people who know the Father are the ones to whom he wills to reveal him. And the ones to whom Jesus wills to reveal the Father are the ones who answered this invitation to come to me, as Jesus said. He would say in verse 29, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." And I may not know everything that's involved in that, but I'm confident that learning from Jesus will result in a better understanding of who God is and how we relate to him. Only Jesus can impart that knowledge. But there's something else that I think ought to impress us about the one who gave this invitation. Not only is he the only one who can reveal the Father to us, he's also the only one in whom all authority resides. You see, one of the characteristics of Jesus' teaching that was noticed by those who heard him speak when he was upon the earth is that he spoke as one who had authority. And there's a very simple reason why he taught that way, and that is because he had it. When Jesus taught in the synagogue at Capernaum, for example, in Mark chapter 1 and verse 22, we're told that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes, not as their lawyers, their students of the law. And so they recognized a distinct difference in the way that Jesus taught them and the way that they were typically taught by their teachers. And so Jesus wasn't one to say, well, the way I see it, this is what you ought to do. He didn't talk like that. He didn't say, this is what other people have to say about it, and maybe there's something in that. Jesus said things like we see in Matthew chapter 5, where he would go and tell them what they had heard about things. You have heard that it was said, and he would point that out. And then he would say, but I say to you. He had the authority to do that, to just tell them what he had to say on that subject. And that authority had been given to him by the Father. Jesus, in fact, there in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 27, Jesus preceded this invitation by saying, all things have been handed over to me by my Father. That's the very point that he makes. And of course, that's not the only place where Jesus said something along those lines. There were a number of times when he made it clear that he derived his authority from none other than God himself. And so, for example, in John chapter 17, this is the night before Jesus is crucified, and he is about to pray for his disciples and by extension us as well. And as he begins, or as it starts in verse 1, before he begins even, it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven, and he said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, since you have given him authority over all flesh. That's what God had done. He had given him authority over all flesh. And of course, we live in the time following that, after the death of Jesus and the resurrection and exaltation of Jesus, because after Jesus died and was raised from the dead, he would say to the apostles in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18, not only did he have authority over all flesh, he would say, all authority in heaven and on earth, physical and spiritual realm, has been given to me. All authority has been given to Jesus. That's the one who stands behind this invitation. And so what that says is that the invitation of Christ is an invitation backed by the very authority of God. And for that reason, it can't be ignored. And I want to ask you, why would someone want to do that anyway? Why would we want to ignore it? This is the one who knows the Father, who reveals him to us, the one who has been given authority by the Father, and yet who would describe himself there in our text, in Matthew 11 and verse 29, as one who is gentle and lowly in heart. I suspect that's not what most people would expect, considering the things we've talked about this morning already. I know it wasn't what the Jews in the first century were expecting when they thought about the Messiah. When they thought about the Messiah coming, they didn't think about someone who is gentle and lowly in heart. They thought about someone who would come in and exercise brute strength. What they got was one who was not only all-powerful, but again, gentle and lowly. And it seems to me that we sometimes have the wrong idea about things like gentleness and lowliness, or meekness and humility. Maybe you're reading a translation that renders those words differently. When most people think about meekness and humility, they don't typically equate that with strength or leadership, do they? Some people seem to equate gentleness with weakness. That's not what that word indicates at all. The word gentle, or meek, as some translations render it, has to do with strength, but strength that's under control. And so that word was used in a variety of different ways in different situations and different kinds of things. For example, it was the same word that would be used in the Greek language to talk about an animal that had been tamed. And so you might have, say, a horse. And I want to just tell you, a horse is plenty strong, but that strength is brought under control when it's been trained. It can still do a lot of damage, but it doesn't do that. And when we talk about humility, I suspect that many people also see that as something that is an opposition to leadership. You can't be humble and a leader. You've got to be assertive and, force your will and so forth. And I think that comes from an inaccurate understanding of what humility really is. Humility is simply evaluating yourself properly. It's not thinking too highly of yourself. That's in there. But it's not thinking too lowly of yourself either. failing to recognize your abilities. And so when it comes to Jesus, we understand that he is all powerful. We see the passages that talk about that. But what you find in Jesus is he doesn't exercise that power or that authority in a reckless or a harmful sort of way. His strength is under control. He doesn't force himself upon people, although I suspect he could have done that. He's gentle in his dealings with us. And so when he said in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, "Come to me and I will give you rest," or when he said in John 14 and verse 6, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me," he wasn't being boastful when he made those statements. He was recognizing the truth. He's calling it like it is. And so let's talk about this invitation that he gave. As I mentioned earlier, some invitations are not really worthy of our attention. They don't offer us anything we really need. But that can't be said of the invitation of Jesus. His invitation involves things that people desperately need, whether they recognize it or not. And the first thing that I want us to see that is offered in this invitation that Jesus gave is rest. Again, in verse 28, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now, this is not rest in the sense of lounging around. This is not, lazy boy in third gear kind of rest that we're talking about here. That's not the point of what Jesus is saying. This is relief from the burden of sin, ultimately, that Jesus is talking about. And so what Christ provides is that relief that all mankind needs. That's the great problem of mankind. And if that one burden is not lifted from us, then I'll just tell you, any other burden that may be lifted is meaningless in the end. We've still got a problem if that burden's not lifted. There will be no genuine or permanent relief. And so when Jesus came into the world, he dealt with a variety of problems that were faced by people. You see that when you read through the Gospels. And so, yes, Jesus fed people who were hungry. And he healed people who were sick. But it's not hard to see as you read through the Gospels that the primary concern of Jesus was to save people from their sins. That's what he was after. He wanted to give them relief in that sense. And I want to suggest to you this morning that this is still the primary concern of Jesus. And I don't mean to say that the Lord isn't concerned about giving people relief from the burdens they face in this world in other ways, but the relief he's primarily concerned about involves the soul. Isn't that what he said in verse 29? "You will find rest for your souls." That's what he was talking about. And so we need to understand that there can be no true relief where there's sin involved, where sin is still in place, where it's still a reality in our lives. It's the ultimate burden to bear. People can't bear it. And Christ is the only one who is able to relieve us of that burden, the only one who can do that. But I also want you to see this morning that Jesus, not only does he offer rest to those who labor, those who are heavy laden, those who are burdened, but he also offers a yoke that fits. And I think that might be a point that is sometimes overlooked when people talk about this invitation. We talk about Jesus saying, "Come to me and I'll give you rest." But there's more involved in it than that. It seems to me that people like talking about the rest that is offered, and that's clearly important. We need that. But I'll tell you, not everyone is as enthusiastic about the yoke that is offered along with it. But what I want us to see this morning is that it's a package deal. Most of us understand that a yoke is a harness of sorts. It was used to attach, animals together. You like yoke oxen together, and also to attach those animals to a plow or a cart, something like that. And it was designed to keep the animal in line. It was used to control them, you could even say. And yet I've read that if the yoke didn't fit right, it would actually rub the animal the wrong way, and it could not only be uncomfortable, but might even be detrimental, would be harmful to them. And the people who heard Jesus give this invitation, they would have understood that the word yoke was often used in a metaphorical sense, not speaking literally about a wooden thing placed across the back of the neck. For example, the Jewish rabbis sometimes talked about taking the yoke of some teacher. That is, they would become a disciple or a pupil of some teacher in order to learn from that person. And I believe Jesus was saying that the yoke people had been bearing was at least in part of the reason they labored to the point of weariness and why they were heavy laden. They didn't have a yoke that fit. Sometimes the Jews spoke of the yoke of the law. They were under the law of Moses, and that yoke was heavy. It was heavy even on the most devout Jews. Peter would say, for example, in Acts chapter 15 and verse 10, he would describe it as a yoke on the neck of the disciples that neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear. We haven't been able to handle that, he says. And so no matter how committed a person was to keeping the law of Moses, they were bound to violate that at some point. And once the law was broken, all it really offered was condemnation. I know there were sacrifices. There were different things that the law prescribed when sin took place. But ultimately, the law could only condemn because it could never really and truly forgive. As the writer of Hebrews would say in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 4, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. They were still there. They weren't dealt with in the absolute sense. And if that wasn't a heavy enough burden to bear, the leaders of Jesus' day, they placed extra burdens on the backs of people by the way of their traditions. They made up rules of their own. Let's just add these on top of everything else. If you recall, Jesus had this to say about the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 4. He would say, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. That's what they did. They placed extra stuff on top. And I want you to notice that when Jesus came, he didn't say, I tell you what, in light of all of this, back to the heavy burden of the law and of the extras that the scribes and the Pharisees put on top of that, I'll tell you what. I want to offer you a life that is yoke-free. It's not what he said. He never promised that our lives would be burden-free. What the Lord offered is a yoke that fits precisely the way it's supposed to fit and a burden that we can bear. We've been given the promise that he's never going to give us anything more than we can handle. Not saying that we don't face difficult things, not saying that it may be beyond our natural abilities, but the Lord's there to give us strength. You see, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13, Paul would say there that no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. What you face, other people have faced. Everybody's faced. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. And then he says, God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. He didn't say he's going to remove it necessarily. But what he did say is that there will be a way of escape, and you'll get through it if you choose to do the right thing. And isn't that encouraging? That we won't be given more than we can handle, that there will be a way of escape, that we're not just going to just be crushed under this burden, and that there is a way out. Isn't that encouraging? It seems to me that people tend to go to one extreme or another. Some people seem to believe that the Lord is simply trying to find things to throw on top of the stack to make life tougher for those who want to belong to him. Here's a rule, and here's a command, and here's something else on that, and here's 5 other things after that. And that's how some people view the Lord. Others seem to believe that the Lord's not concerned about us bearing any load whatsoever. He just provides rest, and that's all he expects us to do, just rest. And I'll just tell you, both of those extremes are wrong. The yoke the Lord has placed upon the neck of those who come to him is one that fits perfectly. He's the one who made us to begin with. He knows how we are to function. He knows what's best for us. And it's designed to help us bear the load he wants us to bear in a world that is, affected by the entrance of sin. We live in a world like that, and there are some problems that come with that, and there are burdens to be borne, but he's not going to give us more than what is necessary. No more, no less. No extra burden to bear as disciples of Christ than what is essential. And so his yoke is easy, and his burden is light in comparison to the alternatives. I don't mean to say, and I don't think the Lord meant to say, that, it's just always going to be easy to be a Christian. Because if you've been one for more than about 37 seconds, you figured out that's not exactly it. It can be hard. It's not always easy to be a Christian. But what I'm saying is that the Lord will never give us more than we're able to handle. Because we were made for the things that he commands. We were meant to have the qualities that he said we must possess. We were created in Christ for the good deeds that he calls upon us to engage in. And he fully equips us with what we need to bear the load. Again, that ought to be encouraging to us, shouldn't it? And so I want to ask you a question this morning. Doesn't that sound like an invitation that everyone ought to respond to? You know, some invitations are given out to a select few, maybe just a few friends, maybe family. But the invitation of Jesus, it's for all who labor and are heavy laden. Last I checked, that's everybody. And so if that fits your description this morning, why would you not respond? It's not too late to take advantage of the invitation that Jesus offers. It was extended, getting close to 2,000 years ago now. But it's not too late. If you're willing to come and you're willing to learn from him, you can have the rest that he promised. You never obeyed the gospel of Christ. Why not do that this morning? If you believe that he is the Son of God, you know that he is the one who can reveal the Father to us, and he is the one in whom all authority resides. You know that. It's one who is gentle and lowly in heart. You know what he came into this world and he did. He died on the cross, and he did that for us. And you know that sin is not his will for us. It's what causes all the problems. It creates all the burdens that we have to bear. And what I want you to see is that in Jesus, those can be removed and be forgiven if you're willing to come to him. If you're willing to turn from sin and to turn to Jesus and to confess that he is Lord, he is the master, he is the one with all authority, and then just submit to his will. Come and be buried with Christ in baptism. Jesus said whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, and he meant that. You can be forgiven of your sins, and you have a brand new life, one that will not be without its challenges. I won't promise something Jesus didn't promise, but one with blessings that are innumerable. And so if we can help you this morning with that, we ask that you come as we stand and as we sing.